Long before maple syrup made its mark, frontier families sweetened their griddled slapjacks, thin, crepe-like pancakes, with dark molasses or lard fried apples. These stacks were poured thin over open fire skillets, flipped fast, and often layered high with whatever sweet fixings could be scrounged. Sometimes they were rolled like tortillas and packed for travel. Slapjacks mattered because they were quick, filling, and flexible, a treat for special mornings and a reliable backup when rations ran low. Molasses gave them depth, a rich flavor that kept bellies full and cravings satisfied. But as sugar became cheap and ready-made syrups replaced homemade fare, slapjacks slipped away from the breakfast table. Today, their name is barely remembered outside old recipe books. Yet reviving this Wild West classic invites us to embrace the joy of slow breakfasts and creative improvisation. Slapjacks may not be perfect circles, but they carry the flavor of perseverance and a sweetness born from struggle. Nothing wowed a hungry group of settlers or ranchers quite like a Dutch oven meat pie. Made with flour-dusted hands and a heavy iron lid, these pies were filled with salted beef, root vegetables, and gravy, then baked slowly over coals. The crust crisped from the bottom up, sealing in every drop of flavor. Meat pies mattered because they were hearty, satisfying, and practical. Leftovers could be reused, and the entire meal cooked in one pot. Cowboys often layered pies with whatever they had: onions, jerky, herbs, or even dried apples. Over time, however, as stovetops and grocery stores replaced fires and foraging, this artful meal disappeared. Today, few people know the thrill of lifting a Dutch oven lid to reveal a bubbling browned treasure inside. But bringing it back could teach us how to turn scarcity into satisfaction, with just fire, flour, and patience. But what came next was even simpler. A Wild West dinner that boiled, baked, or bubbled in a single battered tin cup. The clang of a tin cup meant dinner was ready. One of the simplest and most beloved meals of the Wild West was a cup of slow-cooked beans with chunks of salt pork. Cowboys packed beans dry and pork cured, soaking them over fire and simmering until tender. It was filling, fatty, and comforting after 12-hour rides. This mattered because it was a complete meal in a cup: protein, carbs, and soul. Beans were cheap, portable, and long-lasting, and salt pork added both fat and flavor. Together they nourished thousands from Texas to Montana. But today, canned beans and quick microwavables have replaced the slow-boiled ritual. We've lost the magic of stirring a pot by firelight and tasting the work in every spoonful. Bringing it back means reclaiming a bit of that rugged simplicity and sharing a story in every cup. Have you ever cooked a full meal outdoors, cowboy style? Tell us your go-to trail recipe or frontier memory in the comments. Before grocery store poultry, settlers hunted prairie chickens, small, lean birds native to the Great Plains. One of the most beloved ways to prepare them was in a bubbling pot of chicken and dumplings. First, the birds were stewed slowly to tenderize the tough meat. Then, biscuit-like dumplings were dropped into the broth, puffing up into savory clouds. This dish mattered because it turned wild game into comfort food. It was warm, hearty, and often the centerpiece of a family's Sunday meal. Hunters passed down their secrets: how to pluck, how to simmer, how to season with what little they had. But as prairie chickens dwindled and store-bought chicken became the norm, this dish faded into regional memory. Today's dumplings are often from tubes, and the chicken's far from wild. But reviving this classic means honoring both the hunt and the hearth. If you've got a game bird and a big pot, you've got history waiting to simmer. On the frontier, rabbits weren't pets. They were dinner. Trapped, hunted, or snared, rabbits were a vital source of protein, and settlers often preserved them through salting. Salted rabbit stew combined preserved meat with wild herbs, onions, and dried vegetables, anything that could be foraged or stored through the winter. The meat was soaked to remove excess salt, then stewed until tender and flavorful. It mattered because rabbits were abundant and easy to catch, making them a survival staple when food was scarce. The stew was rich, nourishing, and adaptable depending on the region's wild offerings. Over time, domestic meat replaced foraged fare, and the memory of rabbit stew faded. Today, few remember the savory scent of rabbit simmering over fire. But wild meats are resurging, and this dish offers a lesson in sustainability and flavor. Cooking rabbit may sound old-fashioned, but it once kept families alive. But some Wild West meals weren't just for surviving, they were made to celebrate, especially when sourdough turned sweet. When settlers had extra sourdough starter and dried apples, they made something rare, a sweet treat. The sourdough apple griddle bake was part pancake, part cobbler. Apples were rehydrated, spiced with cinnamon, and folded into tangy batter, then cooked on a greased skillet until golden. The aroma alone turned heads at camp. This mattered because dessert was rare on the trail, and this dish used simple pantry staples to create something special. Children would watch as the apples caramelized, their patience rewarded with sticky, warm slices. Sometimes topped with wild honey or pork drippings, it was frontier luxury. But sweet sourdough dishes disappeared as sugar became cheap and boxed desserts dominated kitchens. Today, few remember sourdough as anything but bread, yet this dish proves its range and resilience. Reviving it offers a taste of ingenuity and indulgence born from scarcity. Grab some starter, slice up apples, and let sweetness rise again. In the Wild West, jerky wasn't a snack, it was survival. When fresh meat was plentiful, settlers preserved venison with salt and smoke, hanging strips over low fires for hours. Come winter, those strips were rehydrated into stews or eaten straight with bread and beans. The jerky supper mattered because it kept food on the table long after the hunt was over. Smoky, chewy, and packed with protein, it traveled well and lasted weeks without spoilage. Cowboys and hunters kept pouches on their belts, knowing one bite could carry them through a long day. Over time, industrial jerky flooded the market, sweetened, softened, and stripped of its grit. But real smoked venison jerky is still a revelation, deep, rich, and connected to the land. Bringing it back means honoring the hunt, the preservation, and the patience. Next time you see a deer steak, try smoking it the old way. One bite, and the West returns. Potach corn was once a staple on the prairie, simple, earthy, and surprisingly satisfying. Corn kernels were soaked in water laced with potash, a homemade alkaline solution from wood ash, then simmered until soft and lightly bitter. Finished with a spoonful of lard and salt, it became a filling side dish or base for meat. It mattered because corn was one of the few reliable crops settlers could grow, and potash helped unlock its nutrition while preserving it. The lard added needed fat, turning a humble bowl into something sustaining. Over time, as refined oils and processed corn products took over, this dish vanished. Few today know the smoky, toasty taste of potash corn or the feel of stirring a heavy pot over fire. But it's worth reviving, not just for flavor, but for heritage. Potash corn connects us to soil, fire, and the ingenuity that made dinner possible. Ever tried cooking with ash, lard, or heirloom corn? Tell us your favorite old-school kitchen trick in the comments. When food was scarce, pioneers turned to what they had, and coyote beans were exactly that. Also known as tepary or wild beans, they grew in arid soil and were foraged, not farmed. These tiny, hearty legumes were soaked overnight, then boiled with onions, dried herbs, and sometimes a scrap of fat or jerky. They took hours to soften, but rewarded patients with rich, earthy flavor and high nutrition. This dish mattered because it represented true frontier resourcefulness, taking what the land gave and transforming it into sustenance. Cowboys joked about coyote beans being tough or tasting like the wild itself, but they ate every last spoonful. Over time, the beans were replaced with easier crops and canned options. Today, few remember their role in feeding settlers. But with heirloom legumes making a comeback, it's the perfect time to reintroduce these resilient little survivors. If you can find them, boil up a pot. You'll be tasting the roots of the West. Yes, it sounds odd today, but gopher pie was once a frontier delicacy. On the vast plains, gophers were abundant and easy to trap, especially for families too poor to afford beef or poultry. The meat was cleaned, parboiled, and stewed with onions, root vegetables, and herbs before being tucked beneath a flaky crust and baked in a Dutch oven. It mattered because it was a resourceful answer to hunger, and when cooked properly, the meat was tender and mild, similar to rabbit. Children would help set traps, and the entire family would take part in preparation. Over time, as pest control replaced trapping and city diets erased wild game from menus, gopher pie all but disappeared. Today, it might raise eyebrows, but the heart of this dish is about survival, gratitude, and using what the land provided. You don't need to eat gopher to honor the idea. Just remember the spirit behind it, making the best from what you've got. In regions where crops failed or game was scarce, settlers foraged for edible roots like wild parsnips, camas bulbs, or yampa. These were cleaned, wrapped in leaves, and slow roasted in coals until soft and caramelized. The result was a smoky, sweet, deeply earthy flavor, unlike anything on modern plates. Root roasting mattered because it was about intuition and survival, identifying what was safe, knowing how to prepare it, and coaxing flavor from the soil itself. Native tribes taught many settlers what to look for, and families would forage together, turning necessity into ritual. But as agriculture advanced and grocery stores removed the need to forage, this earthy cuisine faded. Few today have tasted wild roots pulled from the earth and baked in fire. Yet the flavors, simple, honest, and nourishing, still speak to something ancient. Try fire-roasting carrots or parsnips next time you camp, and imagine the quiet thrill of living off the land. But our next dish was a frontier showstopper, layered, saucy, and good enough to serve in the saloon on Saturday night. The American West wasn't just Anglo, it was deeply shaped by Mexican vaqueros and their rich food traditions. One frontier fusion dish that emerged, the buckaroo Enchilada Stack. Tortillas were layered like lasagna, filled with pinto beans, wild beef or venison, chopped onions, and fiery homemade chili sauce. It baked over a fire or in a Dutch oven until the edges crisped and the center bubbled. This meal mattered because it was the best of both worlds. Hearty cowboy ingredients married with Mexican cooking technique. It became a favorite among cattle crews working in the Southwest. But as Tex-Mex evolved and canned enchilada sauce took over, the homemade layered stack faded from the campfire. Today's enchiladas are often rolled and microwaved, but this old-school stack was a celebration, flavorful, bold, and built to feed a crowd. Reviving it is more than nostalgia. It's honoring cross-cultural roots and the meals that bridged languages over shared plates. Before barbecue sauce or ketchup, molasses was the go-to for sweetness and depth. One of the most comforting Wild West dinners combined slow-simmered beans with slabs of bacon and generous pours of dark molasses. Cooked over open fire, the dish was thick, smoky, sweet, and filling. Everything a working cowboy needed at day's end. It mattered because it balanced indulgence with economy. Beans were cheap, bacon was preserved, and molasses offered long-lasting, shelf-stable sugar. Families passed down their own tweaks. Some added cider vinegar, others tossed in a chili or onion. Over time, canned baked beans took over, and molasses was pushed aside by processed sweeteners. But this dish wasn't just a side, it was the meal. Reclaiming it today means slowing down, letting things simmer, and remembering that a bubbling pot of beans can still feed the soul. Have you ever made a dish with just a fire, a pot, and some patience? Tell us your favorite slow-cooked memory in the comments below. Ash-cooked Banic was the go-to bread for trappers, traders, and travelers. With no oven in sight, they mixed flour, water, fat, and a bit of salt into a thick dough, then buried it in hot ashes or pressed it against rocks by the fire. Minutes later, they'd uncover a smoky, blistered flatbread, crusty on the outside, tender within. This meal mattered because it was incredibly simple and adaptable, requiring nothing but basic rations and fire. Scottish immigrants brought Banic to North America, and it became a wilderness staple from the Yukon to New Mexico. But over time, bread became packaged, yeast-driven, and far removed from its rugged roots. Today, few people know the thrill of baking bread right in the coals. Banic invites us to get our hands dirty, embrace imperfection, and enjoy bread as our ancestors did, by feel, not recipe. Next time you're camping, skip the hot dog buns and make Banic instead. It's bread with backbone. But not every preserved meal was warm. Some were pickled, pounded, and tough enough to crack teeth, yet they fed a nation on the move. In the Wild West, preserved food wasn't a side dish. It was survival. One of the most polarizing but prized combos was pickled pig's feet served with hardtack, the rock-hard biscuit that could last for years. Pig's feet were boiled, brined in vinegar, and jarred with spices. Settlers ate them cold, straight from the crock. Hardtack, often soaked in broth or coffee, was the chewable carbohydrate that rounded it out. This meal mattered because it was durable, reliable, and didn't spoil. It offered fat, protein, and crunch when fresh food wasn't an option. Over time, refrigeration and fresh meat rendered this meal nearly obsolete. Modern palates balk at gelatinous textures and tough biscuits, but this dish tells a deeper story of resilience, thrift, and the art of making the inedible edible. If you've never tried it, consider it a challenge from history. It may not be elegant, but it kept people alive. That's a kind of flavor worth respecting. On the frontier, no part of the animal went to waste, and bones were often the most prized. Cowboys roasted beef or bison bones over fire, then scraped out the marrow to make rich, buttery gravy. Poured over day-old sourdough or slapjacks, it became a rib-sticking dinner that brought warmth on cold prairie nights. This meal mattered because it captured the essence of frontier cooking: resourcefulness, richness, and simplicity. The marrow was packed with nutrients and deeply satisfying, a reward after a long day's ride. Families even dipped potatoes or cornbread into it, savoring every bite. But as butchers stopped selling bones and low-fat trends dominated modern diets, marrow-based dishes disappeared from kitchens. Today, bone marrow is making a high-end comeback, but its roots are rugged. If you find beef shanks or soup bones, roast them and bring back this forgotten delight. It's the Old West in a spoonful, bold, rich, and humble. In saloons and ranch houses alike, buffalo tongue was once a delicacy, roasted whole and served with mustard, vinegar, or pan drippings. The meat was tender, flavorful, and surprisingly refined for a frontier dinner. Roasting tongue took hours. It had to be scrubbed, boiled, skinned, and basted over fire. But the result was unforgettable. This dish mattered because it symbolized respect for the whole animal and the belief that every part had value. Buffalo were sacred to many native tribes and essential to survival for settlers. Tongue, though uncommon today, was once reserved for honored guests or celebratory meals. But as tongue became associated with undesirable cuts, it vanished from menus and minds. Still, it deserves a comeback, not just for taste, but for tradition. Roast one and you'll understand why cowboys called it the filet mignon of the prairie. Our final dish isn't meat at all, but it was the dessert that brought joy after even the roughest ride. After long days of grit, gunsmoke, and trail dust, frontier families needed comfort, and nothing delivered like Apple Brown Betty. Sliced apples were layered with crumbled stale bread, brown sugar, and spices, then baked in a Dutch oven over glowing coals. As it cooked, the scent drifted through the camp, drawing smiles even from the weariest cowboy. This dessert mattered because it required almost nothing. No butter, no fancy flour, just scraps and fruit. Yet it transformed those scraps into something warm, golden, and soul-satisfying. Apple Brown Betty was about resilience, turning leftovers into celebration. Over time, boxed cake mixes and frozen pies pushed this humble dish aside. But it's time to bring it back. No electric mixer required, just apples, fire, and a sense of joy. Make it once, and you'll taste the gratitude baked into every bite. What's your family's go-to old-school dessert? Share your favorite rustic recipes in the comments. We'd love to try them. I hope you enjoyed this journey through forgotten Wild West dinners. Which ones will you try at your next campfire? Subscribe for more history-rich meals and timeless traditions. Until next time.